All right, we're live. Welcome back to Sunday Morning Live, everybody. Give some people a chance to jump on here while I mess with my settings and get them changed as usual. So give me just a second. If you're watching by replay, I really appreciate that you're here watching as well. You can fast forward a minute or two, or just be patient with me while I get this figured out. Okay. Sorry for the long pause there. So I want to start the conversation this morning by referencing Barbara Simons. If you're not following Barbara and you're in any way connected to or interested in deconstruction, religion, Christianity, spirituality, and you haven't been following Barbara Simons on Facebook, I would highly recommend that you do that. She puts out really thought-provoking stuff. And the thing about Barbara is that she is I've had her on my show a while back. She is a true forerunner in the truest sense of the word in this deconstruction movement, because she was awakening and deconstructing and has been exploring and working with spirituality long before anybody else, long before I deconstructed, and long before anybody else that I know. So she's got a few years on us in this thing, but she's also just an incredible thinker, and the way that she's able to articulate stuff is really good. So again, I would suggest that you go out and follow her if you're not. She's written a couple books. But anyway, the reason I'm talking about Barbara, she posted something yesterday, and I didn't have a chance to discuss this with her ahead of time because I've been really busy, but she posted something yesterday, I think it was yesterday, within the last couple of days, about how we are being courted, this courtship between the masculine energies and the feminine energies that are inside of us. But it was one statement in there that really caught my attention. And essentially, I'm going to paraphrase here. So, Barbara, if you're watching, feel free to correct me if I get this wrong, because I'm paraphrasing what she said. But essentially, what she put this statement in there: what if there is no ego at all? Something like that. Like I think she said, I'm wrestling with this whole concept of the ego, and what if there is no ego at all? And then she mentioned Sigmund Freud, and even put a quotation in there, basically referencing Sigmund Freud and Sigmund Freud's work as where this idea, this concept of the ego has come from in our culture and in our society. And I have been thinking similar thoughts for a lot of years. But, and I'm breaking a rule. So I had a rule when I was a preacher that if I got some new insight, new thought, new idea, back then we called it new revelation, then I would sit on it for a while before I would talk about it, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't practicing what I was preaching, but that I was preaching what I was practicing. And I wanted to have time to let something incubate, to think it through, to prove it out before I ever presented it. And so sometimes that'd be a few weeks, sometimes that'd be a few months. There were some things, it was even a few years, thoughts that I was having and thinking before I would release those things as a preacher. So I'm breaking that rule this morning because that post for me struck a chord on something that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I haven't been able to crystallize my thoughts. I haven't been able to find a language to describe them, not even for myself. I'm not even talking about, I haven't found a way to communicate this to other people. I don't know if you can relate to that, but sometimes when you're working with intuition or you have intuitive thoughts or instinctual ideas, and they're just there at that level of intuition, they're just there at that level of instinct, and you haven't really formulated them or found a way to formulate them or found a way to crystallize them, not even for yourself. And so that's what happened to me when I was reading Barbara's post about the ego. But she talked about in there, she talked about the ego, and she talked about the false self, what we call the false self, because typically the concept of the ego in spiritual circles is considered to be that false self. In spiritual paths that take their lead from what I understand to be Eastern philosophies, talk a lot about non-dualism, this concept of non-dualism, and how the ego creates a false sense of separation and this false. Oh, Barbara, I'm glad you're on, so you can participate if you want to. I was talking about you. If you're just jumping on, I'm talking about your post about the ego that you put up and some things that it crystallized for me and helped me get my mind around, or at least start thinking about. And so spiritual teachings, spiritual paths that take their lead from non-dualism say that the ego is the problem because the ego creates a false sense of separation. And then Barbara rightfully pointed towards psychoanalytic theories and the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud when she was talking about the ego. And then there was a guy that came after Freud, one of his disciples, I can't remember his name, who articulated this idea of the false self. So to some degree, even though this language, I'm going to tell you, I've got a bachelor's degree in psychology. I've got a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and I've been training in that field for decades, literally decades. And I'm going to tell you that this language of ego and the false self is never brought up. It's never studied. It's never addressed. It's never talked about in therapy sessions unless the therapist has a bending towards some kind of spiritual path that talks about the false self or talks about the ego. But anyway, what really struck me, what really got to me in a good way, was this concept. What if it's all bullshit? What if there is no ego? What if there is no false self? And that was a thought I'd never really had. That was something I'd never really considered. As much as I try to be aware of my own assumptions, my own presuppositions, as much as I try to challenge those, as much as I try to at times falsify those in my quest to understand who we are as human beings, and really, more importantly, understand how to help people who are really struggling with some kind of an existential crisis. Who am I? Why am I here? Or why am I suffering? Why, people that are suffering from depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. So I'm able to connect, everything that I'm doing on some level for me is always about how can I best serve myself first in understanding these concepts and working through my own existential crises. And how can I help others who are on the same path? And that's an assumption I had never challenged. And at first I was kind of like, ugh, because part of my awakening, a big part of it, like the highest value, the value that drove a lot of my thinking and a lot of my decisions in this area had to do with living out an authentic self, living out a true self. And that presupposes a false self. And I had been approaching the ego for years, kind of felt like one of the lone defenders of the ego, saying, no, the ego's not bad, the ego's not wrong, it's not something to get away from. Because when I started to deconstruct from Christianity, I went immediately into what we label the New Age movement. I hate to use that term because it's been used as a pejorative, and also it's so broad, it covers so many different concepts. But I think generally what the New Age movement covers is, at the end of the day, a holistic movement, a holistic healing movement, a willingness to get outside of the scientific boxes or the medical boxes or the clinical boxes and approach health, both mental health and physical health, from a spiritual perspective. So I was really wired towards that movement. It feels like that movement fits well for me, especially when I deconstructed from Christianity and left, the Christian movement and became vilified for it, as we all have to some degree or another. And there was a lot of talk about the ego. I really appreciate and have appreciated the work of Eckhart Tolle, or Eckhart Tolle. I'm not sure. I've heard his name pronounced both ways. I've appreciated his work. I read The Power of Now back in when it first came out, the late 90s, early 2000s, and devoured it, highlighted it, practiced it, preached about it, found all kinds of patterns in the Bible. I want to say I preached a whole year on some of the concepts that were in the book, The Power of Now, finding them in the scriptures. And he talks a lot about the ego, the egoic mind, and talks about the false self. A lot of people in the contemplative tradition of Christianity that goes back to the Middle Ages with, Catholic figures like John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila or Madame Jean Goyon, just to name a few. That also, the language of the false self starts to be used in that. So in the early 2000s, again, late 90s, early 2000s, around 2001, 2002, the work of Thomas Keating, Father Thomas Keating, came across my path, and he talked a lot about centering prayer, wrote a lot about centering prayer and contemplative prayer. And so then I moved on from there to Eugene Peterson and Henry Nouwen. These names might not mean anything to any of you, but some of you may have shared components of the same journey. And Thomas Keating talks about the false self and talks about contemplative prayer as a way of escaping or a way of healing the false self. And so it was very easy for me to transition into some of these thoughts about the ego as it was being talked about and bantered about and written about in these other alternative spirituality, New Age sort of circles. And so what I'm saying is that much of my thinking was based on this idea of a true self and a false self. And like I said, my primary goal, my primary value was to follow the true self, to live this authentic life, because so much of what I had lived within Christianity, I didn't have the permission to live authentically. Parts of myself, I didn't have permission from God, seemingly, or from the scriptures or from the Christian community to live an authentic life. That wasn't encouraged. That wasn't a value. So when I began to deconstruct, I began to say, okay, I'm committed to this principle. I still don't know about God. I don't know all about the Bible. I'm walking through this process, going through this process in my life. But one thing I am sure of is that going forward, I'm committed to this practice of authenticity. And that was very healing for me. But it also, it sort of presupposes this idea of the false self. So when I read this yesterday or 2 days ago, whenever it was, when I read this post that Barbara put up, the way I was hearing it, the way I was understanding it was I was confronted. Let me put it this way: I was confronted with this question: what if there is no ego? What if there is no false self? And Barbara, I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but that's how I heard it. That's what confronted me. What if there is no ego or no false self? Because one of the things that I noticed when I got into the New Age circles was that in Christianity, we're trying to eradicate the flesh. We're trying to cleanse the sin nature. We're trying to live by the grace of God and by the power of the Holy Spirit so that we can escape ourselves. We can escape our original sin. We can escape our sin nature, our carnal nature, walking after the Spirit, not after the flesh. So we use whatever language for that. Paul talked about spirit and flesh. Other people talk about the higher self and the lower self. Some people talk about the masculine part and the feminine part, which also comes out of psychoanalytic. At the end of the day, it comes from psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory, because Carl Jung, now not Freud, but Carl Jung developed this idea of the anima and the animus, that each one of us have the opposite gender expressing itself, usually in our dreams, and it gets pretty complex. But that idea can also be traced back. That's my whole point. Can also be traced back, but it's all built on this assumption. And I could recognize, okay, this is the same thing. Like if I'm fighting against the lower self from the higher self, I'm just doing Christianity repackaged in a different way. It's not really changing my life. It's not really changing the way I think about myself. It's not really helping me. And it's not really that much different. I'm just using a different conceptual structure to live out the same phenomenon. I'm going to say that again. If you shift from trying to get rid of the flesh to trying to get rid of the ego, if you shift from trying to have the higher self lording over the lower self, bringing my lower nature into submission to the higher nature, then we're talking about the same phenomenon of trying to crucify the flesh or kill the flesh or mortify the flesh or cleanse the sin nature or be born again or be a new creation. It's the same phenomenon within the self. We're experiencing the self within the same way. The experience itself is the same, exactly the same, but we're conceptualizing it differently. So we conceptualized it one way under the doctrine of original sin and Adam and Eve and being born in sin, being born as part of a fallen race, this sinful redemption form of spirituality that I've talked about. That's how it was conceptualized. And then you move over into other spiritual traditions or teachings, and it's conceptualized in a different way, meaning there's a different language to describe it. There's a different map, if you will, but it's the exact same territory, meaning it's the same experience of the self within. It's the same essential process. It has the same essential components to it. We're just using different language to talk about it. So it's just like going to a party in a different costume. It's the same party, or changing costumes at the party, right? You're still going to a costume party. It's the same party. It's just different costumes, different ways of describing this. But never had I ever thought or challenged the idea, what if there is no false self? What if there is no ego? What if we throw out those conceptualizations altogether, instead of assuming that these are hard facts or assuming that this is the truth about the way things are? And so what I'm doing today, what I'm doing in this video, is I'm talking through, because I'm very much an external processor. So I don't know what I think until I hear myself say it oftentimes. And that can be wearing on the people in my life, my family, my friends. I can't just sit down all the time with family and friends and talk out my thoughts. So I'm using this platform to talk about this. So here's my caveat. I'm not going to say everything that I think correctly or accurately. I'm not going to get it all right in this video. And you may find this video very challenging. You may even find this video triggering and immediately feel the need to jump and defend your position about the ego, or your position about the false self, or your whatever the nuances that I get into here. And I'm going to draw from arenas where I have some knowledge but no expertise. Now, I have expertise. I think it's safe to say I have expertise in the psychological arena and to some degree in the spiritual arena. But I may draw from some other things like history and linguistics to talk about some of this stuff. And these are areas that I'm less evolution. I'm going to talk about that because that really factors into this. And these are areas that I'm not as, I have some knowledge, but no expertise. So just chill out, just relax, get a cup of coffee with me. Put your thinking caps on if you're still with me and interested in this, because I think this can be really revolutionary to our lives. But I want to say up front, I'm reserving the right to backtrack on anything that I'm saying. And I'm not trying to put this out in a way that I'm saying, this is how it is. Here's how you have to think. We've all been wrong this entire time, but I've got the truth. I've got the illumination. I'm not putting myself out in that way whatsoever. I'm just really trying to work through my own thinking externally, but at the same time, provide some food for thought for you. And also, let's go down and question our assumptions. When we question our assumptions, we may come back to the assumption that we held. But if we do come back to the assumption that we held, it's going to be stronger. It's going to be more effective. It's going to be more powerful for us in our lives than if we just assume something and don't even know that we are assuming it. So let's bring in some history. Let's bring in some historical information on this. Every society, every ancient society, virtually every indigenous society that I know about, derives their meaning, and I've been talking about this quite a bit in my other episodes. They derive their meaning from story. They derive their meaning from a myth, from mythology. They try to understand who we are as human beings, what's out there, what's the nature of reality, and how should we approach life? What's the best way for us to live? What's the healthiest way for us to live? From the perspective of stories, from the perspective of mythos, not necessarily fairy tales. There's a difference between myth and fairy tale. I've talked about that a lot. So the mythos, the myth, the story of the Western civilization is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That's why the spiritual traditions in the West begin, especially in Christianity, with sin, fall, and redemption. The human problem, the human experience is framed in this perspective that there was a great time when, the first man and the first woman were living in paradise with God, and there was no suffering and there was no death. And then they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they died. They experienced some kind of separation from God. And this was all formulated and put out there by a guy named Augustine of Hippo, which I may come back to a little bit later, because there are some correlations between the mythology of Augustine of Hippo and the philosophy of Sigmund Freud that are fascinating. There's some fascinating links there. But the bedrock of our entire civilization that grew up over the centuries, the foundational myth, the foundational story, was the story of Adam and Eve. This idea that there's something wrong with us. There's something innately wrong with us. This begins to crumble. Really, it started before this. But this really crumbles. The watershed moment, if you will, in the history of Western civilization, in the history of Western thought, was the work of Charles Darwin and evolution and survival of the species. And the reason it's so important, and the reason that it's such a watershed moment, is not because he got everything right, or it's not because we've finally found the truth about who we are and what the nature of reality is, and it's all based on evolution. It's that it completely dismissed the ancient myth of Adam and Eve, and with it did away with the bedrock story, the foundational understanding of meaning that we had as a culture in the Western world. Completely eliminated it, because now there is no Adam and Eve, and there is no fall, and there's only this progression of life, this sort of random survival of the species. In other words, survival of the species became the foundational understanding of the Western world. So we shifted. I've been talking about this, how there was a shift in the 3rd or 4th century away from mythology to some degree, right, into philosophy, and that those of us that deconstructed from Christianity have deconstructed from the philosophical underpinnings of the Western Christian world. And so the foundation of the secular world, which our world is now, at least there's two competing stories still. There's still the fundamentalist story that is adamant, no, the myth is true and this is reality and this is how it is. And we all need to be saved and we all need to get out there. And then there's the philosophical foundation, which is Darwinism. It is evolution. It is survival of the species. And so enter Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud comes up, and because myth gives meaning to our lives, it helps us give shape to our lives. It helps us conceptualize our experiences, understand who we are, understand why we're here, understand where we're going. When that myth is done away with completely, it causes a real existential crisis. Most of us that have gone through deconstruction have experienced this. We had a sense of meaning, we had a sense of purpose, we understood who we were based on these Christian philosophies, these Christian teachings, and then we deconstruct from those, and we have to rethink then not just the entire story as it relates to true or false in this Aristotelian type of thinking, but we have to rethink it in terms of, what does this mean to me? What does this mean about my life? How shall I live now, seeing as how the things I used to believe, I don't believe anymore? And so there's a reorganizing, there's a chaotic process that goes on inside of us that then has to reorganize in some other way. And it's a process, and it's a difficult process. It's a challenging process. Well, so you can imagine about the time that psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud and these guys come on the scene, that this foundational myth of Adam and Eve and the fall has been done away with in scientific circles and in much of secular society, right? So now we need to come up with a new concept of who we are. We need to understand who we are. We need to understand how we work. We need to understand what we are. And so that's what Sigmund Freud did. Sigmund Freud came along using all of the assumptions, all of the philosophical presuppositions, all of the evidence, if you will, all of the science that was being based around this concept of evolution and this concept of survival of the species, and said, okay, what does that mean for human beings? And this is really crucial to his thinking and his development of what the ego is. And you'll see why I'm belaboring this point in a moment. So, from the perspective of experience, objective experience, we have a set of agreements, right? We agree this is a cup. I'm telling you there's coffee, and it's a chipped cup too. There's coffee in it. We all have an agreement about what coffee is. Nobody's going to think I'm drinking tea or Coke if I say I'm drinking coffee, because we have these collective agreements around language and what language means. So objectively, I can say that's a cup of coffee, right? And objectively, you're not going to question it because it's very, very concrete, right? So we can say objectively, follow me on this. We can say objectively that there is a big difference between the human species on this planet and every other species. Now, some would probably argue, and they may argue correctly, that, elephants are just as developed in their brains as human beings, dolphins, whales, whatever. But that doesn't take away from the fact that elephants are not building cities. Elephants are not threatening the existence of the entire planet through either nuclear developments, nuclear weapons, or harm to the environment, whatever the case may be, right? They're not doing that. Elephants are the same everywhere. In every zoo, they're going to have a certain pattern that they follow. The dolphins and whales certainly aren't ruling the earth in the way that human beings are. So we are distinctly different from nature or other species, yet we are a species ourselves. We are a part of nature, right? So the way that ancient people would understand this, they're trying to understand what is this difference now that humanity had evolved, really, if we want to take the evolutionary perspective, had evolved to the place where we could self-reflect, where we could think about our choices. We could think about the consequences of our choices. And we had to figure out, and we could live together in societies, and we could advance as a species. We could improve ourselves as a species, not through natural selection anymore, but through this self-reflective, analytical minds that we have that make us so distinct from everything else around us, excluding aliens, of course, but you know what I'm saying. And so for the Christian mythology, the Jewish, the Abrahamic faiths, humanity is different from all of the animals. You see this in the foundational story of the myth of Adam and Eve. Humanity is different from all of the other creatures in this world, and that we are the only species that's endowed with the image of God. That God said, let us make humanity in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, right? So what separated humanity, what made us different, was that we were given the imago Dei. We were given the image of God. We were the image bearers of God. We were like God. And then the question, that begs the question, well, if we're like God, then why is things so messed up? If we're like God, why are there natural disasters? Why are our kids dying of sickness and disease? Why do we die? So if we're like God, why do we die? Then, okay, there has to be a reason for that. So the reason that's given in the story is that Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Watch this. They have the capacity to be like God now. They have the capacity to think like God. They have the capacity to discern. This is so important. They have the capacity to discern or distinguish between what's good and what is evil, which nature itself does not have the ability to do. There are no dog police forces that are enforcing the rules of doghood and getting on the stray dogs, or rounding up the feral cats and putting them in cages or finding them homes. So nature just is. It just does what it does. We are the only beings that seem to have this capacity for discerning an outcome and then judging whether that is going to be a productive outcome or a non-productive, whether it's going to be good or evil. So that's why the tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We've put, including myself, listen, my foundational message for 20 years was the story of Adam and Eve and understanding the human dilemma from the perspective of Adam and Eve. And we put all kinds of fancy religious interpretations on it and around it, where we've said this means, you know, religion is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and spirit life is the tree of life, and we need to be eating from the tree of life instead of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we can put all kinds of meaning, but that none of that has anything to do whatsoever with the original purpose or intent of the story. I did a video a while back where I drew from the work of a scholar, I can't remember his name right now, that showed how the story of Adam and Eve was a polemic against really the hunter-gatherer period, and more importantly, a polemic against polytheism. More importantly than that, a polemic against the goddess, and a polemic against femininity and against women, and had its misogyny built into it. And all of that can be true, but at the end of the day, they're not sitting there necessarily writing this story thinking, how are we going to do away with the goddess, and how are we going to blame women, and how are we going to, you know, all of this various different stuff. No, it was there to simply describe, like every myth, it was there to serve the purpose of telling us what is and why are things the way they are, and who are we and how are we to respond. So what makes us different is we ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So now we could discern good from evil, which nature itself cannot do. This is the whole purpose of the story of Job. I'm really getting in the weeds with this. I always do this. So I'm going to try and stay on track. So, but then it produced death in us. It produced death. And then death as a consequence of eating from that. Now nature is the way nature is. There is a curse on the earth. Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you'll bring forth food. So a movement away from, we can see elements, right, of moving away from the hunter-gatherer period into the agricultural period. And marriage, as we know it today, is a byproduct of agriculture because women were property. And that's what marriage is. That's the foundations and the roots of marriage. It just is. There's another book out there called Marriage, A History that just does a brilliant analysis of all this. Very thick, very complex, very scholarly. If you have trouble sleeping at night, if you struggle with insomnia, you may want to pick it up. No, I'm not. That sounds derogatory towards the author. I don't mean to be derogatory towards the author. It's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant book. It's just a little bit nerdy. And by that, I'm saying affectionately. Yeah. Anyway, social media, sometimes I worry so much about who I'm offending or who's taking me the wrong way. It's part of the reason I get into the weeds so much. Now, Prometheus is another myth, an older myth, where I think it's Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. And we look at that as modern people and say, "Whoa, well, that's how they explained the invention of fire." No. The fire of the gods that was given to humanity was this same capacity for discernment, this same capacity for self-reflection, knowledge. So instead of being in the image of God, we have the fire inside of us now, right? All of this has to do with what is the nature of things. So enter Sigmund Freud into this conversation. And he has this idea, building on the theories of Charles Darwin, that we're not so different from the rest of nature. Let me just say this about the story of Job. Here's the interesting thing about the story of Job. Natural disasters happen to Job. A natural disaster comes and kills Job's family off, right? And then this natural disease, this sickness and this disease comes on Job, and then the rest of the book he's wrestling. So the entire scope of the book of Job is a human being trying to understand nature, trying to understand the cruelness of nature, the awfulness of nature, trying to understand, why do natural disasters happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? And then ultimately, the book of Job ends with a dialogue with God, and God begins to speak about how he's the creator. Basically, what do you know? You're just the creation. I am the creator. But here's the powerful thing about the book of Job. What the book of Job is showing us is that humanity, at least on this planet, has developed or evolved into the ability to look at nature and say, maybe nature isn't all that. In other words, maybe nature has this dangerous, horrible element to it that is killing us. And why do we die? But if we are only nature, if we begin with the assumptions of materialism and physicalism and Darwinism, then we are nature critiquing itself. So in other words, until human beings, at least on this planet, showed up, there was nothing in this planet, nothing with the ability cognitively, psychologically, or within consciousness to say, hey, maybe this is wrong. Maybe this isn't the best way to go. Nature, maybe you ain't all that. I'm just trying to drive home the context out of which Sigmund Freud and his theories come. So Freud was on a mission to do away with religion. Religion was a delusion of the masses. It was an opiate of the masses in Sigmund Freud's mind. And so he was trying to understand the human animal. And so he says, in the same way that nature is cruel, in the same way that there are these natural instincts within creation, and the entirety of evolutionary theory is based on right? Survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction. And survival only exists, watch this, for the purpose of reproduction. Because without reproduction, there can be no survival of the species. Charles Darwin and the evolutionary thinkers were not concerned, or they weren't saying anything really about the survival of the person, the survival of the individual, the individual ant or the individual cow or the individual human being. It's the survival of that species. And the only way the species can survive on the planet is through reproduction. This is so important. Everything else, the need for food, the need for water, the need for air, the need for shelter, the need for protection, the need for the individual to survive is so that they can have sex. Bottom line, sex is the most important component of evolutionary theory, because without sex, without reproduction, I'll use a softer term for you so you don't get triggered. Reproduction is the game, man. Reproduction is the main thing. Let's keep the main thing, we used to say in church. And so reproduction is it, man. It's the entire game in nature, and everything else is there to serve reproductive processes, to preserve, at the end of the day, children, offspring, right? Otherwise, the species dies out in one generation. It dies out. So there are two forces in nature when looked at, and only two primal forces when looked at from this perspective. One is reproduction or sex, and the other is death. That's it. So in order for Freud to formulate his theories, he had to operate within those two parameters. So what he's saying is basic to human nature. Human nature. We talked about a sin nature. Sigmund Freud talked about human nature. So if we are a byproduct of nature, then what resides within all of us are the urges for reproduction, survival, and death. And so from Freud's perspective, our instinctual drives, what he called the id, has two powerful components to reproduce or have sex, and an obsession or fixation with death. So that's where he begins. That's where he begins his theories. Now, he's also coming up in the Victorian period, and this is a time of intense purity. Views on sex. Really, if you want to get down to it, when it comes to this whole thing, sex is the elephant in the room in the conversation that nobody wants to talk about in the culture in terms of its foundational meaning to our lives. So he worked with patients who had, and so he uncovers these, what he would have called, what people would have thought of, what probably are still thought of today as perverse sexual impulses. For example, what he would call the Oedipus complex, or what he later would call penis envy. I mean, there's so much misogyny in all of this. But the idea that the male son wants to copulate with his mother, or that the female wishes that she was male and therefore had penis envy. Like, for Freud, this is the whole thing. But don't be hard on him. Don't be out there pounding the drum, beating the drum for evolution and beating the drum against religion and curse Sigmund Freud, because in a lot of ways he was probably doing it, thinking about it on a lot deeper level than most of us were. And that's how he came to his conclusion. So no, Freud was not a pervert. He didn't come up with these, well, he could have been, but he didn't come up with these ideas because he was a pervert. He came up with these ideas because he's trying to fit the concept of the soul, the psyche, who we are as human beings within the context of Darwin's theories. So for him, we have these instinctual drives, and we have this image of God part. He wouldn't have called it the image of God, but what I'm describing, the fire of the gods, the knowledge of good and evil, let's just call it that. We've been gifted, we've been graced, we've been cursed, we've evolved into this knowledge of good and evil, and we live together as societies. And so we do not conduct ourselves, and we cannot conduct ourselves like the animals conduct themselves. We have to conduct ourselves with ethics. Think about it this way, and I don't mean to be crude, but I think all of us would be familiar with a scenario of having a pet that goes into heat, right? A dog that goes into heat, a cat that goes into heat, whatever. And what's generally to most pet owners, what's important, most responsible pet owners, what's important to you when your pet goes into heat? It's to keep the strays away, right? I mean, we had a litter of kittens. We had a litter of puppies because the neighborhood dog knew that she was in heat and came over and had his way with the female. Now put that in a human context. If that just went on in our societies with no discernment of good and evil, what would we call that? What do we call that when that happens? Right? We don't think anything of it when a dog does it. We don't think anything of it when a cat does it. The cat or the dog, like the cat doesn't have to go to therapy because the cat, you get what I'm saying? We're the only ones that wrestle with these things and struggle with these things because of our ability to discern good and evil. So I crack up, one of the things in the holistic environment that cracks me up is this romantic idea that we have about nature. I grew up on a farm. I grew up hunting. I grew up in the woods. I grew up in the mountains. I grew up in the wild. There's nothing romantic or sweet or nice about nature. It just does what it does. It kills, it maims, it fights to the death to survive, and everything that's reproducing is having some form of sex. So from Freud's perspective, that's also us. That's also in us. But we have to learn how to survive in a culture. So what do? We create laws. There are laws against that kind of thing. We instill ethics. There are certain behaviors around the way people relate on the job, let's say, that may not necessarily be illegal, but we definitely consider them unethical. So for Freud, you had two selves that were developing. You had the instinctual self, what he called the id, that you could do nothing about. And it was, dun, 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 just like Augustine, corrupt, and dun, 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 just like Augustine, rooted in an obsession with sex. So you have these desires, you have these things that you want to do, that you want to act out on, and you have to suppress them because you have another process that's being formed that he calls the superego. That is the mind of the group, the ethical and legal mind of the group, of the society, that says this is the best way for us to live together as a society. So I have this struggle between what I really want to do. This is Freud talking here. A struggle between what I really want to do and what I'm told to do. And so then he postulates the creation of a third part in this process that he called the ego, or that we call the ego. Because remember, here's the thing I want to say about all of this stuff. Freud was Austrian. Freud thought and wrote in German. So anything that we get has been translated for us, right? Here's the interesting thing about language. The more analytical, this is what linguistics will tell you, the more analytical a culture is, the more they lean into logic, the more they lean into reason, the more they lean into rationalism. You see the appearance in language of articles, like a definite article. What is an article? For those of you that, have never had to use this stuff since you graduated from high school. And an article if I say a or the's a better example. The computer, the cup of coffee. It's defining that there's a noun. It's defining a noun phrase. There are entire languages that have no articles, that have no definite articles. They said, why would they have definite articles? Because they don't think as conceptually or as rationally as we do. And they understand, perhaps better than we do, that life is mostly a process. Life from a human perspective is mostly a process. And so they don't thingify something. They don't say, this is a thing, this is an it, because they understand this is a process. I'll give you a few examples. I used to do marriage counseling. I don't do marriage counseling anymore. I really didn't do it when I was in pastoring either. I kind of learned after the first year that I wasn't the guy to come to for marriage advice or marriage counseling. I hated it. I hated the counseling, not marriage. And so somebody comes in and says, our marriage is in trouble. Okay, your marriage is in trouble. Or they might say the marriage is in trouble. Well, what is it about the marriage that's in trouble? Our communication. Maybe they say there's problems in our relationship. What's the problem in the relationship? The relationship, definite article. It's a noun. Relationship is a noun. Marriage is a noun. What's wrong with the relationship? Our communication. The communication is off. It's a noun. None of that exists as a noun in reality. That's all map and not territory. Because a noun technically is a person, place, or thing. If I say this cup, that's a noun. That's a thing, right? If I say Aaron Tomlinson, that's a person. If I say I live in Pueblo, Colorado, that's an actual place that people can go. So we take processes. Relating is a process. There is no such thing as a relationship noun. There's only relating. It's a process. It's a noun term that we use to describe the process that's happening. We thingify a verb. Same thing with communication. Relationship is a process of interacting between two people. Communication is a process of interacting between two people. And then we generalize that process by calling it a noun. Communication, we generalize the process of the way we relate to one another, and we thingify it, we nounify it by calling it a thing. So some of this confusion is because we're English-speaking people and we really depend heavily on definite articles, and it affects the way we think about things. So when we say the ego, when Freud is developing his concepts of the id, the ego, and the superego, he's not, I don't think, thinking about them as things. He's not nominalizing them. He's not thingifying them. He's describing a process that we experience. The process is this. According to Freud, we have these desires that are innately in us as a product of nature that is a byproduct of evolution. So therefore, we have an obsession with sex and we have an obsession with death. These urges are there. They come up all the time. They come up every day. But we live together as a society. We can't act like animals. We can't act like the natural beings that we are. So there's this other process that happens where we learn how to behave. We learn what's legal, what's not legal. We learn what's ethical, what's not ethical. We learn what's good manners and what's not good manners. We learn what's expected, what's not expected. And it's easy to see then why he focused on childhood, because think about this with children. A child will just take their clothes off, man. If they're hot or something, they'll just strip down, take their clothes off at 2, 3 years old, run around giggling, and not think anything of it. And we have to teach them when it's appropriate to undress and when it's not appropriate to undress. We have to teach them to go into a room to change. We have to teach them to go into the dressing room to try on a new article of clothing. We don't just take our clothes off and try on the new dress or try on the new suit in the middle of Dillard's, for crying out loud. But innately, see, what Freud would say is that innately, no, we want to just do these things. And so how do we balance between the urges that are inside of us and what is going on out here that we are taught and told by society. So there's this tension, there's this pull in two different directions between the id and the superego, between our innate natural desires and the requirements of living as a productive member of society. And so there has to be a bridge between these two. There has to be a decision maker in there that says, I'm going to pursue this instead of this, or I'm going to pursue that instead of this. So it mediates and manages these two forces that are at work in our life, and that's what he called the ego. So for Freud, the ego wasn't a thing. The ego was a process. We talk in spiritual circles about the ego like it's a thing, the false self like it's a thing. And I really started thinking about this yesterday, and I'm like, what is a false self? And what am I really saying when I say the false self? The interesting thing is, and other people have come along and said this that are way smarter than me, they've come in and said, that Freud just reinterpreted Augustine in the context of evolution rather than in the context of mythos and religion. Because for Freud, our nature as a species was essentially evil, inclined to corruption. And it took the superego to balance that. And that the healthy person had a healthy ego, and a healthy ego meant that you could balance well those two things in your life. And the ego, for all these psychoanalytical guys, the way it managed this was through defense mechanisms. So the entire ego is made up of defense mechanisms. If I were to do a list of defense mechanisms, denial, this creeps into the 12-step program. You have to own up first. You have to admit that what you're doing. You have to admit that you're wrong. You need to let go of that denial, that defense mechanism. Denial. Minimization is another form of denial. Well, I did it, but it's not that big of a deal. Or a repression, deflection, projection. These are all functions from the psychoanalytical perspective of the ego. Now, here's the problem. Here's why we don't learn this today as therapists, is because it doesn't work. Sitting on somebody's couch talking about this stuff does not make you better. It does not balance your ego. It does not make the process better. It doesn't improve your depression or help your anxiety. It might help you understand why it's there. It might help you understand how you act and what you do. It's the same thing with trauma therapy today. And I believe in trauma therapy. I've done a lot of trauma therapy. But for a lot of people that go into therapy, it's just revisiting over and over and over again something that happened to you when you were 8 or 10 or 15 or 25 or whatever the case may be. Now, I'm not negating the reality or the benefit of doing trauma work, but we've kind of taken it into realms that the research is showing, not this just as an Aaron talking, the research is showing isn't all that beneficial. It can be beneficial to resolving symptoms of PTSD, it can help with anxiety, it can help with depression, but if that's all we do, then we're constantly navel gazing. We're constantly revisiting these traumas. And so what the research shows now is that healthy trauma work is trauma work that resolves it. But if all you do is go to your therapist and talk about your childhood and talk about how it formed you and how it affected you and how it's affecting your relationships today, you're actually ingraining on a deeper level in your brain through the neural pathways. You are more deeply ingraining the problem state that you're trying to solve, that you're trying to fix, which is why most really good trauma-informed therapies today don't mess with talk therapy. Anybody that's ever had EMDR with someone who knew how to do it and did it right, or brain synchronization therapy, or something out there called, I forget the letters, but there are all these therapies. Tapping has become real popular. It's all based on this idea of somatic therapies. All of these are saying, we know talk therapy doesn't work, so we're trying this stuff instead. Does that make sense to you? So I got to thinking about Barbara's post. that there really isn't a false self. It's impossible for there to be a false self. Think about this. Just think about this phenomenologically. It's a fancy word for saying, think about how this works out in your life. Does this work for you? Not just in your head, not just a great concept, not just something that makes you feel good or feel better, but how does this really work? If I have what is a false self? Because at the end of the day, I'm making choices so for the let me come back to this. So in psychoanalysis, the false self is, there's this self I want to be, which is more controlled by the id. And there's the self that I have to present myself as within society. And that self that I'm presenting myself as is not true to what's really going on the inside. So it's a way of trying to explain this phenomenon of, I really want to do this, but I know I can't do this, so I'm going to pretend this way. This could be really simple. Honey, how do you like my new hairdo? And you're sitting there thinking with your significant other, I think that sucks. I liked it better the other way. Why did you do that? And you don't say that. You say, oh, I really like it. Really looks good on you. God, I just can't stop losing weight. And you're really thinking, yeah, I wish you'd stop losing weight. But you say, oh, no, you look fine. You look great. That's just a simple example. But once that example's over, where'd the false self go? I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about, am I telling the truth from my heart or am I lying? And then we judge, all lying is bad. I don't think all lying is bad. But that is a conversation for another time. You see what I'm saying? So we have this process between what's authentically happening in here and what is expected of me out there. And I have to have a component, a part of my decision making that mediates between the two. But once that event is over, once that exchange is over, where's the false self? Where's the ego? The desire may linger, right? The consequence of my choice may linger. If I say, God, you look terrible, and I continue to do that in my relationship, I hate your hair. I hate what's going on with you. Eventually that relationship, you might find yourself out the door. That might last. But the process itself, do you see what I'm saying? Where is it? It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Now, what if we extrapolate this out further? What if we extrapolate this out beyond just the psychological definitions and workings of the ego, and we extrapolate it into self-help? Which the entire self-help industry, by the way, is built on the same presuppositions that there's something wrong with you. There's something that has to be fixed. This is the curse of the Western culture. The curse of the Western culture is in our mythology. We were told that we were sinful, that we were innately wrong, that we were innately opposite to God, and we had to figure out how to live together, and we had to figure out how to fix these bigger problems like death. What happens to us when we die, or suffering, or having a sense of well-being and happiness, right? Because in and of ourselves, innately, we were wicked. Innately, we wanted to do what was wrong. Innately, we wanted to do evil things. And Augustine told us it was a sin nature. Sigmund Freud comes along and says, oh, we've done away with that story, so it's not a sin nature. It's just that nature itself is based on reproduction, it's based on sex, and it's based on death. So we all have these weird things inside of us towards that lean towards sexual perversion or lean towards death and destruction. So we either want to, okay, I'm gonna keep this clean. We either want to make love or we want to kill. We either want to create or destroy. He's just providing a framework for understanding meaning, understanding who you are without Adam and Eve, and in this new context of the survival of the species, right? And we've all gotten stuck in this sort of game of gossip. I remember playing that. I don't know if you ever played that, but I remember, I'll never forget sitting in a circle in first grade and somebody whispering a secret all the way around the circle, and somebody wrote down what the secret was, where it started. And by the time it got around to the end person, it was completely different, totally different. And it's like, how in the world did that happen? I remember being, as a child, being shocked. How in the world did that happen? Almost everything that gets into pop culture starts that way. So from this perspective, somebody whispered in Freud's ear. Let's just say Darwin. There were other people too that influenced him and his thinking. But let's just say Darwin whispered into his ear. And then he whispers it into someone else's ear. And then they take it and whisper it in someone else's ear. And then it goes over here. And then at some point you change the language, so it gets translated differently, so that by the time we pick it up, we're just sitting in the circle somewhere and we pick it up and we think we got it because the person next to us told us this is what it is. So we just assume, oh yeah, there's an ego. Oh yeah. And then if we extrapolate this out into self-help, right? So the entire self-help industry is based on you suck. There's something about you that's wrong. There's something about you that needs to be fixed. And I've got the way. I will sell you the way to get there. I will sell you the way. I will teach you the way of enlightenment. I will teach you how to build your self-esteem. I will teach you how to make more money. I will teach you how to feel better. Right? It's all built on the presupposition that there's something wrong with us. Non-dualism. Why is non-dualism even a thing? Because we are self-reflecting individuals, and we know there's a world in here and a world out there. That's the primary duality. The world in here interacting with the world out there. That's the whole ball game. That's the whole thing. What's going on in here and how what's going on in here interacts with what's out there, and how what's out there interacts with what's going on in here. That's it. That's life. It's summed up really simple and easy. Now, if I believe what's out there is God and Yahweh and Jehovah, I'm going to follow the Bible in here. If I believe what's out there is no God, no Yahweh, no Jehovah, just evolution, just a cosmic randomness of whatever, I'm going to relate in that way. How does that affect me? How does what's in here affect what's out there? Right? See it? And this is a process that Freud was trying to describe. Now, bringing this into the bigger, so non-dualism says, no, there is no in here or out there. That's it. When people talk about oneness, being one with God, mystical union, we're all one. Whatever I do to you, I'm doing to myself. Come on, guys. Intuitively, we know that's not true. And I really, really, like, pray for me, people. I really struggle with this non-dualistic approach, the way it has been approached with spiritual teachers, because we just grabbed it out of the blue from somewhere, from the Vedas, which were translated into English. Do we really understand them? Or is it just a patch that a new shiny patch that we've sewn onto our old garment, and our old garment is still being controlled by these forces that are making us think that there's something wrong with us? So now we're going to call it non-dualism. Because at the end of the day, listen, if we get in a fist fight and I put you in the hospital, I didn't feel that. If I do something bad that traumatizes you and you have nightmares from it, I'm not having the nightmares. I'm not in the hospital. I'm not having to work through it emotionally. So how can we say, let's just be honest, whatever I do to them, I do to myself? Well, because of karma. Okay, well, guess what? Karma doesn't work in this life, for sure. Now, maybe the Vedas had it right. And if I do something if I'm an awful person in this life, then I'll have to experience it in the next life. But then that begs this question, right? You ready for this? If I do something harmful to someone else, karma presupposes that they did it in a past life. So I'm just the instrument of karma. Or at least you could say in some instances, maybe not in every instance, they didn't do it in a past life, but maybe I do something that I need to experience karma for in the next life. But how do I know the difference? How do I, if I'm just the agent of karma, if I hurt somebody because they hurt somebody else, I was the agent of balance. I was karma in action. So then do I have to pay for that in the next life? And you see, it's just, again, making sense of the nonsense, right? So then the ego in this context becomes the sense of dualism. There isn't really a you in there and an it out there, or a you in there and a you out there. We all just have this perception, this stubbornly persistent illusion of self. What is self? At its most basic level, it is I am a point of awareness. I am a point of consciousness that is interacting with whatever feels, looks, seems, or is separate from me. The difference, the contribution, according to Pierre Grimes, who studied with Alan Watts, who is a voice that I trust on these matters, Pierre Grimes says that the number one contribution to humanity that came from Western philosophy was the concept of a self, the concept of a soul. And the concept of a self necessitates, let me say it this way. I'm going to say it this way. The concept of a self is in complete opposition with a non-dualistic frame. With all this talk about oneness and stuff, and it feels so good, and we love it, and everybody's talking about it. And if we want to fit in, we've got to do that. That's why I put in the description, this may be my most controversial teaching, because that's the ego that they're trying to get rid of from that spiritual perspective. They're defining the ego as the sense of self. And what I've been trying to say for years is you can't lose that sense of self. Even if you say, I experience oneness, there's duality there, because there's an I. In Greek, you're saying ego experienced oneness, because the word that gets translated I, that means I in English, is the word ego. That's where we get it from. I experience oneness. I am thinking this. I am wondering this. I am asking this question. I went to the store yesterday. I'm working on a book. I have this idea. But when we bring it back into, well, let's just experience oneness. If I experience oneness, there was an I that experienced it. Therefore, from the non-dualistic perspective, non-dualism cannot exist. So then what are we trying to get rid of? What are we trying to heal? Let's come back. Let me just bring this full circle, and I'll talk about this more during the week because I didn't want to keep you this long. But the higher self and the lower self is really, in its elements, a Freudian concept. Because the higher self is whatever the society tells us is valued by the society. It doesn't matter if it's the larger society that's governed by laws, or if it's the subculture of Christianity, or if it's the subculture of the subculture, fundamentalist Christianity, or it's the subculture of New Age spirituality. Telling us the higher self is compassion, the higher self is high vibration, the higher self is light. Did you discern that on your own? Or did you hear somebody talk about that and think, oh yeah, it makes sense. That fits with my experience. So I'm trying to conform, whatever it is I'm trying to conform to that doesn't match what's going on inside. We have this division of the higher and lower self. What if none of that is true? What if it's all just one, just us? What if it really is about just being? I am, from the standpoint of I am a being. and I am full of potential, and I do possess within me the ability to discern good from evil. And that in and of itself is not good or evil. It's not, I got to get rid of all, I used to teach this a lot. I got to get rid of all judgments. Try that. Yeah. I think it's important to be loving and accepting. Don't get me wrong. But when you buy a car, you're making a judgment. When you order on a menu, you're making a judgment. But we impose all this stuff on other people and on each other that just absolutely makes no sense, because it's not real, because we thingify processes. So just think with me, and I'm going to further develop this. Like I said, I'm just thinking this through. What if there is no false self? There are times that we are not true to ourselves. There are times that we present ourselves as other than what we are. There are times that we even lie to ourselves about ourselves. But those are individual instances, and they are all actions. It's impossible for that to construct an entity that we call the false self. Now, to get into this brings up a lot of questions. I won't get into all the ins and outs of it today. I'm just laying a foundation for it. So hopefully that was helpful. Should I go back and look at some of these comments? Marie says, I agree. I love Barbara, and her insights are so valuable, just like yours, Aaron. Oh, thank you very much. Somebody says they're watching from India. That's awesome. Barbara says, coming out of the consensus trance. That's really Barbara's gift, isn't it? I mean, one of her. That's not your only gift, Barbara, but that's really one of Barbara's gifts, is to help us awaken us and help us come out of the consensus trances. Shannon says, I'm an external processor as well. Marianne's late. Oh, I appreciate the comment there about the Catwoman, but I'm gonna leave that off the video. Let's see. Many of his theories, I'm assuming Freud, have truth in them or make sense. They make sense when you understand that he's describing a process, not a thing. At least that's where I'm at. Mary says, I love Freud, I have to admit. Michelle says, we learn what works for our highest good and what doesn't. Yes. Yeah. What if we approach life from that standpoint? All of life is a learning. All of life is an experiment. All of life is learning, accumulating wisdom, learning what works for me and what doesn't. And we just left it at that. Barbara says, excellent. Trauma therapy. I had to stop reliving it in therapy. It was wearing me out. Yeah, for sure. I always tell people, as a therapist, you go to therapy for better or for worse. Let's see what Steve says here. Our self/soul is in reality Elohim. We have forgotten as humans and look outside to try to have self. Please a God outside of us. When we come out of Egypt, we return home and remember that our ego was one and in God in the beginning. Our freedom is when we leave behind the struggle. Not sure what that word is. We leave behind the struggle and allow our light body to draw our earthly body and join in a marriage. The two shall become one flesh. It is finished. Come home. So, Steve, I don't know if you saw Barbara's comments, but she was talking about you're being courted and was using the same metaphor of marriage to describe the union of the self. And I very much appreciate that perspective. I understand exactly where you're coming from. What I like about what Steve said here was, are we drawing our sense of self from the outside? Or are we living from a empowered sense of self on the inside? That's really good. I have to spend more time with that. Everyone has a program that they're peddling. Yeah, and then Barbara sums it up. She says, what are we trying to get rid of? It's the question of the day. Michelle, yes, and that actually is the Eden story according to the Hebrew wording. That's why I wrote a book about it. Awesome. And it's a great book. Eden Songs, I think it's called. I encourage you to pick that up. I was telling Michelle I'm going to have to pick that up and read it again. So, hey, we're all in this together. None of us has it all figured out. Not saying anything that I'm saying is right or better, or I'm just trying to find the best way for myself and then share that with other people as well. And I just thought what Barbara shared was brilliant. It got me thinking in a whole different way. And it excites me because this is a real paradigm shift. Like some things will, nuance your ideas or change your ideas about something. But when your whole paradigm has been false self, true self, authentic self, ego, non-dualism, whatever the paradigm is. And then you think, what if none of that is real? What then? What would life be like then? And so it's exciting for me to pick up this line of thought and make my hopefully contribution to that arena of thought. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this. If you haven't joined the New Day Global Facebook group, I would encourage you to do that. I will be following up on this sometime during the week, as this is kind of my new mission to work through this and figure out the path forward without thinking about ego or false self or higher self, lower self, just thinking outside of those paradigms entirely. So anyway, God bless you. Have a great Sunday and a great rest of your week. And I'll be with you next week for a